Well, good evening, everybody. I see some familiar faces, so I guess I didn't chase everybody off. But just let me start off with a quick survey. Who was not here this morning? I'm going to embarrass you. Wow, a lot of people. Wow, that's amazing. Totally amazing. Usually, it's, almost everyone came earlier and you just came back again. But that's exciting. While I'm speaking, we're going to pass around a piece of paper, which is basically, hey, would you like to get our email newsletter? So they're just going to come around. When it gets to you, just take one if you want it. If not, just pass a stack along down the row. They'll be coming from this way. So you guys can do that whenever, and I'm just going to jump into this. Now, this morning, every word that I was supposed to say was right here on my screen. Now, I didn't quite stick to my notes, but I had lots of notes. This evening, I have no notes. This is very much a free form. I know what I'm going to say. But I don't necessarily the order I'm going to say it or how it's going to come out. This is actually really difficult to do because I'm going to try to summarize the work of 9 PhD scientists. I'm the editor of this book, and it was actually my idea also, and I wrote the second chapter on genetics. And I'm going to try to summarize the work of 15 PhD scientists, and this is 3 years of my life that went into these two things. This is really difficult just to summarize it and give it to you in brief pieces, but I'm going to try. However, the goal here is not to just talk over everybody's head. If I just sat up here like a machine gun and gave you fact after fact after fact, that would not help anybody. So several times in here, I'm going to stop and I'm going to pause, and I'm going to give you a big idea, a really cool idea that you can use to try to think about these subjects and maybe make you a better scientist or maybe even encourage you in your faith a little bit. Okay, that said, I need to talk about my ministry, Creation Ministries International. We are 40 years old. There are a lot of us on the road. In fact, we have offices in 7 different English-speaking countries. In fact, about the only major English-speaking country we don't have an office is in India. But you pick one, British Commonwealth style plus America, and we're here. Our job is to go to churches and train people and give them answers to the questions that they have. So hopefully I'm going to answer some of your questions tonight. I set this up. I'm going to try to answer some big questions that people have. But this book and this documentary, there are 8 chapters here. The fossil record, the origin of life, cosmology, which is really Big Bang stuff, genetics, radiometric dating, the geologic record, morality, and natural selection. I cannot cover all those topics in one sitting. It would be painful to listen to all that. So I'm just going to do 3. My chapter on genetics, natural selection, and morality and ethics. Because morality and ethics has a very big part to play in the pursuit of science. If you think about scientists, we have to trust the last guy, that he wasn't lying to us about the data he collected and the papers that he published. That is really difficult to do if there's no system of trust in place. I'm already going to get off topic here. I'll bring that up again later. Okay. Are we good so far? Now, if I do say a bunch of highfalutin words and you're like, I have no idea what this guy's talking about, do this. No one else will see it. I'll see it. I'll say, oh, okay, I'm sorry. Back up. And I'll try to say it again in a way that makes more sense. Already, good practice. Yeah, when I was a little kid, I had 2 teeth pulled, and dentist's like, okay, when it hurts, just raise your hand. So I raised my hand right away. He's like, oh, that's really funny, kid. He kept on pulling. So, subject number 1. Why on earth didn't it come up? Well, that's really funny. Oh, because I wasn't at the beginning of my talk. Oh, I'm looking at the slide wondering what it was. I hit play, and on one screen it said one thing. Okay, now I know where I am. I love technology. We do produce Creation Magazine. A lot of you signed up for Creation Magazine earlier. The response actually was amazing, and thank you for that. If you would like an opportunity to get Creation Magazine, it's on that little piece of paper there. I'll explain more at the end how to fill out and what kind of gifts you'll get. If you are really interested in a subject, you might want to take a look at our Journal of Creation. You can sign up for this online. It only comes out 3 times a year instead of 4 times a year. But this is really hard stuff. So I take it there's probably some creation junkies in this room because you came to hear my talk on a Sunday night at the church, and a lot of you don't go to this church. Some of you need to be getting this and aren't. This is really where the cutting edge of the idea generation happens. And I cannot tell you the number of profound things that I've read in a journal of creation. I started subscribing this right after I got to college. So I think I've been getting this since 1993. I've learned a lot. We also have creation.com. Now, old magazine articles and old journal articles eventually migrate onto our website, but it takes a couple of years for that to happen. But we're constantly writing new articles on up-and-coming things. Some new discovery, boom, we'll have an article on it. The one thing that took us a while, though, several months ago, there was a report of amber, and inside this piece of amber, they found a dinosaur tail with feathers. We didn't know how to answer that because we had too many different opinions amongst us, and one of us was from Singapore, and that man said, I'm aware of the amber trade. He talked about all the different ways you could fake it. And we said, oh, so we didn't actually know if it was real or not. So that one did take us a while. But in general, we're Johnny on the spot. Something comes up, we will publish as soon as we can, within a day or two. And you'll see that. And very often, those things turn into one of our weekly email newsletters. Very, very often. Why is it not going? Come on, technology, catch up with me here. There we go. Do we have the piece of paper here? Yes. On the left-hand side of this form, this is where you can sign up for our email newsletter, if you would like it. You can just drop these on any one of the tables back there. We'll pick them up afterwards. We ask for your name, your email, and your zip code. And the zip code, because many of you are here probably because you got an email. What we do is when we send out a speaker, we will email everyone within a certain radius of that speaker, say, hey, come hear this guy, bring your friends. That's what that's for. Okay. Now, I happen to be a marine biologist. Now, marine biologists are known by many different names. But after many years of scuba diving and getting sunburned and having a great time, I ended up in the genetics laboratory, and I ended up getting a patent on that green color that turned out to be a gene that was easy to sequence, easy to clone into bacteria. Yes, I made bright green, bright red bacteria, and then engineered them into these fish. So really my background is in genetic engineering, which could be an entire 3-day lecture in itself. The future of genetic engineering is going to have profound influences upon all of your lives, especially in medicine, and also it's going to continually raise moral questions that we as a society can't answer. For instance, what's your response going to be the first time someone clones a human? What's going to be your response? Are you ready yet? Do you know that identical twins are clones? Oh, yeah. Well, there are companies now that will routinely clone your pet, a prize bull, racehorses, routine. Dolly the sheep, that was a stone age of genetics. Modern day, this is something, and you know what? We have the same genes as all those other animals. The same processes that happen in a dog happen in us. There's theoretically nothing preventing us from cloning people. Legally, you can't do it in some countries. Okay, got it? All right, put all that aside. We're not talking about genetic engineering. We're talking about science, and science is challenging us. But let me give you a framework, an idea of how to think about science. What if science was just like, I'm going to call it an interpretive filter of reality? What if science was just a way of thinking that might help to explain things? So one way of thinking is Zeus is standing on top of a mountaintop, and he's got his lightning bolt ready, and when I get out my petri dish and I do an experiment, he's going to either zap my lightning bolt or not zap my lightning bolt. That is a way of thinking. It's not really very conducive to science, is it? Now, it's a really bad scientific idea, but you might actually run an experiment and get the right results, even though Zeus had nothing to do with it. Or let's say it this way. Imagine evolutionary theory is a certain way of looking at the world. And it is. And it does get some things right, doesn't it? Yes, it does. Absolutely, it gets some things right. And that's what Charles Darwin talked about. He never talked about what he didn't get right. He talked about what he did get right. And that's what evolutionists ever since then have talked about. Absolutely, it gets some things right. But that doesn't mean itself that it is right. Now, I'm not going to claim that my view of science is perfect. I would never do that. But can you see that if the reality is these red lines, and your way of thinking is the gray lines, that the tighter you get your gray lines lined up with the red lines, the more you'll be able to explain in science? You can see that, right? Yeah. That's science. The reason that evolution seems so profound as a scientific idea is it claims to explain everything. But what they're doing is they're only explaining the things in between those lines. They're actually skipping over tons and tons of data. And they can no longer get away with what they got away with 100 years ago. Because the scientific revolution has changed everything. Okay, I'm using words already. I haven't really defined anything. Let's define a couple of terms here, real simply. I'm going to prove to you that science depends upon philosophy. Easy. I have a PhD. What does that stand for? Yeah, piled higher and deeper, post hole digger, haha, yeah. Now, what does PhD stand for? I have a doctor of what philosophy? What philosophy is the underlying philosophy that draws all of evolutionary science? What is it? It's called naturalism. Ism is a belief, right? Theism, belief in God. Naturalism, it's a belief in the natural world. It's the belief that natural processes can explain everything. My doctorate is in philosophy of no God. You catch that? Absolutely, that is the underlying philosophy underneath the pursuit of modern science. Sorta. Now, what is evolution then? Well, I'm a biologist, right? But I'm not an evolutionist. What's a biologist? He's someone who studies life. I study living things, and I can't get enough of it. I'm not even scratched the surface of what's there. It is an amazing occupation to be in. If you ever want to become a biologist, you're going to be poor the rest of your life, but you're going to have a really good time. So I would encourage you, enjoy life. If you take biology, say this is biology, and you add to it the philosophy of naturalism, you naturally get evolution. Evolution is simply the outworking. It's trying to explain life using only natural causes. That's called evolution. Now, I would call myself a biblical creationist. What does that mean? It means I take biology, the study of life, and I add my views of God, theism, and you get creation out of that. Now, there's different views of God, there's different understandings of God, and there's different types of theism, there's different types of creationism. There's young earth creationists like me, there's old earth creationists, there's evolutionary creationists, even though that's an oxymoron, a contradictory terms, they call themselves evolutionary creationists. There's lots of different ways to approach this because there's lots of different views of God. Okay so far? Okay, what's evolution? Have you ever heard it defined, evolution is just change over time? I heard that in just about every college class I was ever in. That is the stupidest definition of evolution you can possibly imagine. No, sorry, not stupidest. It's the lamest definition of evolution that you can imagine. Why? Because I believe in change over time. But I don't believe in evolution. All the change that Darwin saw is change. Yeah, okay, that happens. Yep, that happens. Sure enough, that happens too. Okay, got it. Where's the evolution? Why? Why am I not an evolutionist? I've had a lot of people say, oh, you believe in change? Ha-ha, you're an evolutionist. No, I'm not. Because what if the change goes back and forth? What if it goes in a circle? What if it goes downhill? Change in itself is not evolution. Evolution has to have upward change. And that upward change, if you go back in time, should trace back, all life should trace back to a common ancestor. Evolution is the belief in the common ancestry of all things. Oh, but you'll never hear it defined that way. Why? Because you can observe change. You can't observe common ancestry. Good trick, huh? All right, everybody take a breath. You didn't know you were getting all this philosophy, did you? The Bible, in the first chapter, makes some very radical claims about history. The Bible, in that first chapter, claims that God created the entire universe in 6 consecutive 24-hour-ish. I say ish because the first day there's no light yet. How can I count anything? But as soon as there's light, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening, morning. 6 times it says that. Evening and morning, there was 1 day, 2 day, third day, 4th day. You know, linguistically, the writer of Genesis painted a box, and you can't escape that box. All God had to do, and there are lots of ways in Hebrew of saying long periods of time. You hear them like, I'm going to bless you to the untold generations, those sorts of things. There's lots of ways in Hebrew to say really long periods of time. None of them are used in this passage. All God had to do was say, there's a little bit of time there. Oh, and we could have driven a truck through that. But he never said that. And this creation week is a week, and they're days. And if that's not a week and that's not days, then my question to you is, when does the Bible start meaning what it means? When do words have meaning? That's a tough question. Now, because as I said this morning, I can guarantee that within this room right here, there's a diversity of opinion on this subject. I know it because there's enough people here, probably have the whole range of opinions right here. If you have done it or are trying to add millions of years to this, I want to encourage you to keep trying. Because I tried for years, and I ended up always running into a brick wall. Oh, I could add millions of years, but to do that, I had to twist words beyond what they meant. Every time. So please keep trying, but be honest with yourself about what you're doing. See if there's a way. I don't think you can find that way, which is why I feel comfortable encouraging you to do that. But why are we here? Why am I here? Why would I even bother talking about this in an audience? It's because of this verse, which I will use at every talk I'm giving this weekend. 1 Peter 3:15. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. We interviewed a famous street evangelist in our Creation magazine a couple years ago, and we asked him, so when you're talking to people on the street, how often does evolution come up? He said, 8 or 9 out of 10. See, evolution, even if it's not a salvation issue, it's not. But it is the main reason why people are rejecting the Bible in our culture today. You start talking to somebody about Bible stuff, oh, come on, Adam and Eve, don't you know we evolved from monkeys? Evolution. In any number of different ways this can come in. Okay, now, this is where I thought I was before. Let's talk about natural selection. You've heard the phrase natural selection, right? Do you know what it is? Do you know what it means? Let me read you something from Charles Darwin himself. Now, this is 1800s writing, and Charles Darwin, I mean, basically, he's got long sections in German in his book because, you know, everyone knows German, right? What, aren't you educated? You don't know German? Oh, I don't know German either. But he has a very thick style of writing. So let me parse this and see if we can understand it. He says, if then, organic beings, or living things, in a state of nature, vary even in a slight degree. Catch that phrase, a slight degree. If in the long course of ages, in other words, we add magic millions of years, inheritable variations arise in any way advantageous to any being under excessively complex and changing relations of life. Oh man, how do you read this stuff? What he's saying is the environment is really complicated. And he's saying, give me something where, this hair is a little bit longer, this dog is just a tiny little bit smaller, bigger, blacker, or whiter, whatever variation you want. Then the severe and often recurrent struggle for existence will determine that those variations, however slight, which are favorable shall be preserved or selected, and those which are unfavorable shall be destroyed. I know that was hard to read, but is that kind of like your view of natural selection? Little teeny variation, give it enough time, and eventually, nature will sort itself out. It doesn't work this way. He was actually completely wrong. Let me give you an example. Let's say I had a twin brother. My twin brother looks like Adonis. I look like me. Nah, of course we both look like Adonis. Duh. But see, what I didn't tell you was, I was born, that's not true. Let's say I was born without toes. I have no toes on my feet. He's got normal feet. Now we're out picking berries in the woods and a bear jumps out. Which one of us gets eaten? What if he's half blind? What if I've got real good hearing? Which I don't, but what if I did? What if, I'm really self-conscious about my toes, and so I run marathons every day just because I want to show the world that I can walk normal, and he's just a, couch potato. What if the bear jumped off on the left side of the path instead of the right side of the path? Dumb luck. You see, even something as extreme as toelessness, natural selection can't see it. There's too many confounding factors in nature that influence whether or not you live or die based on that trait. There's traits that interact with each other, the environment is interacting, and there's just, you get struck by a meteor and I don't get struck by a meteor. I mean, what can you do? There's too much noise in the system. Now, you all remember, sorry, you young people just plug your ears. You young people, you need to hear this, right? You need to hear this. Old people, you'll think this is silly. Back in Grandpa's day, the car, when you turn the radio on, you had these buttons that you'd push, and this little thing would move and try to catch the signal. And then when you kind of caught it, you take your dial and you go, because they didn't have this thing called digital yet. It was all analog. And sometimes you get a station, and you'd be like, and, oh, that's my favorite song. You'd be like, and then every once in a while you catch a word or two. What's the problem with this? There's too much noise. You weren't close enough to the radio station to get a good signal. And you know what? Even if you knew what song was being played, if there's too much noise, you would never hear it. You could listen to it for 1,000,000 years, and you would never hear your song if there's too much noise. Darwin didn't understand that. He said, give me millions of years and nature will sort the noise out and that trait will naturally rise up, but it doesn't happen. Plus, natural selection is not evolution. People were writing about natural selection a long time before Charles Darwin wrote about it. This man is named Edward Blythe. Now, I don't think he was a young earth creationist, if you would, but he was definitely a special creationist. He definitely believed that God created the universe and created life. He wrote several papers, which I've read, they are brilliant, in 1835. Charles Darwin was born, he was in his 20s when these were written. In fact, Charles Darwin was on the Beagle going around the world as a young man when this man wrote Natural Selection, the whole thing. But in his model, natural selection was a thing that God used to purify species and get rid of the weak and get rid of the lame and keep things from going extinct. Darwin said, oh no, natural selection is that thing that evolves species. So the idea wasn't Darwin's. Let me give you an example of natural selection. This is from Evolution's Achilles heels. Let's see if my video works here. Go, 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 boom. Oh, come on now. Yeah, oh, there it is, okay. We got two bacteria. We got a mutant one on the right here. It's kind of shriveled up. It's got a little teeny pore and an antibiotic. That purple thing can't get in. Some of the food can't get in. But the normal bacteria, the food gets in and the antibiotic gets in. Oh, who dies in that situation? The degenerate one lives? Yeah. Most every example of natural selection that we've seen in the world, in the laboratory, in the natural world, is natural selection acting on something that's broken. Let's see. A lot of you cannot digest lactose. That is the normal state. the closer your ancestors were either to Eastern Africa or Scandinavia, the more likely you are able to digest lactose as an adult. I can't. I'm not a mutant. There's a gene that, because lactose is in mother's milk, and as an adult, you don't need it anymore. So, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, that gene switches off. There's an off switch. But in some people, the switch is broken. And what does that do? It allows you to eat a nutritious, fatty, protein-rich food called cow's milk as adults. And it's really good for you in some ways, if otherwise you would be starving. But that doesn't happen. Here's another example. Sickle cell anemia is endemic in Central Africa. Sickle cell anemia is a paralyzing, horrible, no good, bad, terrible disease. It hurts to have sickle cell anemia because under low oxygen conditions, the hemoglobin in your blood cells forms crystals. And those crystals, they get lodged in your joints and stuff. And it's just, you actually usually die pretty young if you've got sickle cell anemia. But if you're just a carrier, you're still not as healthy as normal people, but your blood's still sickle, and they tear apart the malaria parasites that live inside red blood cells. So if you carry that trait, you're much more likely to survive to adulthood and have babies. And yet it stinks to have it. But you know what? If you got a choice of having malaria or being in pain, which one is better? Being in pain. As far as, because evolution, okay, I should have said this earlier. Do you all understand that evolution has nothing to do with survival? I've actually been using natural selection incorrectly here. I meant to explain it a little better. Natural selection has nothing to do with life or death. Natural selection is all about having babies. You don't have to live or die. You could just have more than the other person. Example, imagine that there's a mountain, and the mountain is covered with oak trees. And it's really dry at the top of the mountain. At the base of the mountain, there's a river. So the ground down here is wet, and the ground up here is really parched all the time. And within this oak tree species, there's a diversity of genes. Some of the genes help the oak tree like dry conditions, and some of the genes help oak trees tolerate wet roots. Fair enough? Now, give yourself several hundred years. Generation after generation after generation of oak trees. Which oak tree is going to produce more acorns on the top of the hill? The one that likes wet roots or dry roots? The one that likes dry roots. Generations later, which genes are going to be better represented up there? The genes that like dry roots. In fact, over time, the genes are going to sort themselves on the slope. And it has nothing to do with death. Natural selection is a really, really bad term. First of all, nature doesn't select. Nature's not alive. What's another term you've heard? Survival of the fittest. That's also a really bad term. Because who's the fittest? Is it the biggest, the strongest, the fastest? The one with the best eyesight? No, it's the one who has the most number of children. World War I was fought on Darwinian terms. Did you know that? The powers that be wanted their armies to fight to get rid of all the weaklings so their race would be stronger. Did you realize that? World War II, that's exactly what the Germans were doing. World War II in Germany wasn't just about getting rid of Jewish people. It was getting rid of the weak Germans so the Germans would be stronger. But there's a problem with this. It's called the machine gun. The biggest, the strongest, the fastest, they ran out, and they all died. And the weenie guy who stayed hiding with the baggage, he got all the girls after the war. It is nothing, it's really, I just use a life and death example again. It's not life and death. It's he who has the most number of children wins. Oh, that's the I'm going to jump to the morality section here. Skip everything here. I'm not going to finish my talk. I'm just going to have to end at the end. Whatever. It's fun. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was a committed evolutionist. she knew that there was two ways for her genes to win. One way would be to have lots of babies. She also knew, though, that white people, actually not white people, upper class British type white people had fewer babies than the poor trash Irish, that's me, the Italians, all the Catholics, black people, Chinese people. All these people had more babies than the aristocratic European types. So there's two ways to win this natural selection. One, have lots of babies yourself, or two, prevent the other people from having babies. There's a very specific reason why she put her abortion clinics in black neighborhoods and poor Irish Catholic neighborhoods. Even though birth control in Catholicism is verboten, she put them there anyway, because secretly people would come there and they have less babies and she would win. Do you understand how, that is terrible. Terrible, terrible. I got to skip over this. I'm going to take too long to explain this. Let's just skip over that. Let's skip over that. It's one of my favorite books. There's only one copy left on the table. I'm going to say it this way. My dear friend, Dr. John Sanford, he came up with an idea. It's an idea called genetic entropy. What is entropy? It's the idea that all things are decaying over time, right? Well, the DNA, the genome, it's part of life, right? It should be decaying also. But see, natural selection is supposed to get rid of all those mutations, all that decay, and amplify the good stuff, and the species are supposed to go upward over time. But what if they didn't? What if they went downward over time? What if they got worse over time? It's an idea called genetic entropy, that even given a Darwinist all the natural selection they want, it doesn't work. And here's why. If you're born without a head, you're not going to have any children. What if you're born blue? Marry a blind person. Right? I mean, think of all the different things you could be born with and you're still perfectly able to have babies. Ugly people have babies, right? Despite the fact that natural selection might get rid of the worst mutations, even the not so bad mutations, or sorry, not even, the not so bad mutations can't be seen by natural selection. Because natural selection, as I said earlier, only deals with how many children you have. If the mutation doesn't affect procreation, it has nothing to do with evolution. And most mutations are so weak that natural selection can't see them. The signal is not strong enough to rise above the noise. Let me show you a chart. This is from a paper that John Sanford and I published in 2012 in an evolutionary journal. Don't let anyone ever tell you that creationists can't publish, because we certainly do. They don't like us, but we were looking around for a system where we could study genetic entropy. We've had 10 years before this. We had 10 years of theory, of math, and computer modeling. And all of it pointed to genetic entropy being real. But we needed to study it in life. The problem is you need something with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of generations and data. And you can't do it for humans because, you know, we've got maybe 1,000 human genomes today, but they don't go back very far. But what we found was the flu. Somebody dug up a body of a woman that was buried in Alaska in 1917. And it was so far north, they basically hacked a hole in the permafrost and covered her. And her body had been frozen since 1917. And I said, oh, look at that. So they took a tissue biopsy, and they found the influenza that killed her, and they sequenced the genome of the 1917 flu that killed more people than died in World War I. At the end of World War I, basically both armies stopped fighting because everybody was sick. You can't fight in the army if all your guys are laying on the ground and doing flu things. It's terrible stuff. But we had a 0 point, the initial outbreak of this influenza. And then we found all of these other sequences from the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s all the way up to the year 2009. And we said, wait a minute. This is 2012. How come there aren't any sequences of this flu in 2010 and 11 and 12? The answer is it went extinct. Actually, it went extinct twice. It went extinct in 1957 the first time. And then in 1976, on the Chinese side of the Manchurian border, it broke out again. But the flu that broke out was identical to flus that were circulating in Scandinavia in 1952. And then later on, someone in Moscow admitted that they opened up an old sample and the flu got out. But why did it appear in China? Good question. Anyway, it's not biowarfare. They would never do something like that. But that's the blue dots. The red dots are 1976 and beyond. And essentially what we discovered was that more than 10% of the DNA of the flu had mutated. But wait a second. The flu is under natural selection. You see, if you had the flu, the only flu viruses you can pass to that guy are the ones that have escaped your immune system. That's called natural selection. If you can't reproduce in someone else, you're dead. So only the biggest, strongest, and fastest flu viruses should be passed on, right? No. Because most of those mutations have nothing to do with the flu grabbing onto that little thing on your cell that it uses to get into the cell. It's like rust on a car. Eventually, every car you're driving today will fall apart to pieces. But a single little speck of rust doesn't do anything. Millions of specks of rust send it to the junkyard. And basically, mutation in the genome is essentially things rusting out, one little thing at a time. And natural selection can't stop it. A car analogy, it would be like, oh, my tires are worn out. I'm going to slap new tires on my car. I'm going to give myself a tune-up, change the oil. That's what natural selection might, because if you don't change your oil, your car is going to poop out pretty quickly, right? If you don't put new tires in your car, what, are you going to get 100,000 miles if you're really, really lucky? If you don't hit any nails? But point is, natural selection doesn't work. Species go extinct anyway. And the number of flu generations here is approximately the number of generations that evolutionists claim separate humans from chimpanzees. Oh. If we really were millions of years old, we would be extinct. All right, take a breath. I'm going to show you another illustration. This is one of those big idea things. I was at a conference. There was a documentary that PBS put together, and they had shown it in public school classrooms all over the country that year. And in that documentary, they outwardly mocked Christianity. But the Supreme Court has laid down the law. They said all instruction must be religiously neutral. So the documentary actually broke the law. And right now there's a lawsuit going through the court systems. Probably won't go anywhere, but it's going through the court systems right now because they shouldn't have done it. But while I was watching this documentary, I realized that every single thing the evolutionist was using to support evolutionary theory, I agreed with. Did you catch that? Do you see the deceit? By saying something that's true, something else is true, that something else is true, something else is true, since all of it does agree with evolutionary theory, therefore evolutionary theory must be correct. Watch. Here is the world of creation. Here is the world of evolution. This is what Charles Darwin did and evolution since then. They get a list of facts that fits their theory. Fits my theory, fits my theory, fits my theory. All these facts must disprove your theory. That's what they say. But this is reality. Natural selection is explainable in both theories. And almost all the evidence that an evolutionist will use is actually explained on both sides. I call this non-discriminating information. It's information you can't use to decide between two theories. And what they do is they give you all this non-discriminating information. See, I'm right. Evolution's true. That is one of the most brilliant arguments I've ever seen in my life. It's brilliant because it's powerful and persuasive even if it's wrong. And that's why the way Charles Darwin and others since him have said things is so difficult to untangle, because a lot of what they say actually is true. You follow me? You know, Charles Darwin wrote an entire book, The Origin of Species. And in that book, he never defined what a species is. But I can't define the word species. Nobody can. It's a Latin word. It means type. Well, okay, fine. But what's a species? You've heard of a zorse or a zonkey? You ever hear of a liger? You know, female ligers can have cubs with tigers or lions. You know that, right? They're not like mules. What's a species? I have no idea. My definition of species is if two things can interbreed, I call them the same species. Red wolves, gray wolves, all domestic dogs, the Australian dingo, the African jackal can all interbreed freely. That's all one species. Yet I have no problem calling the gray wolf and the red wolf different species because they look a little different, they act a little different, they live in different places. Okay, fine. But just because we call it a species doesn't mean actually they're genetically distinct. Boy, that's a huge problem. Because all of a sudden, if we can't define what a species is, how do we talk about the evolution of species? Wow, okay, there was actually an article that appeared in our Journal of Creation, it just appeared on our website not too long ago. It's about the cat kind. And in it, I should have had this. This would have been perfect right here. They've got this chart of all these different species of cat, from the lion and tiger all the way down to the house cat. They had pumas on there, they had lynxes on there, they had the serval and all those cool like mini cats that look kind of like Bengal tigers, but they're like a double-sized house cat. All those kind of species of cats. And they had all these lines connecting which ones are known to interbreed. Now, there's not a direct link between lions and your kitty cat because, well, one of them always gets eaten. But there's an indirect route. The big cats can interbreed with the little cats, and the little cats, the medium-sized cats, and medium-sized cats can interbreed with the little cats. There is a continuum from your tiger to your tabby. There really is only one cat species. The Bible describes created kinds, that God created different things to reproduce after their kinds. Well, the Bible uses reproduction as a criterion for what's in a kind and what's not. So do biologists. If two things can interbreed, they're the same species, they're the same kind. Dogs and cats cannot interbreed, but all dogs can interbreed and all cats can interbreed. All right, I'm going to skip over a few things here. I'm going to skip over this specifically, just for fun. I'm going to go to the next section, genetics. I'm going to start off with a statement, a fun statement. The field of genetics has been at war with Darwinism since genetics was invented. Gregor Mendel came up with the laws of genetics just a few years after Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. I just read an essay a couple months ago. This person realized that when you read Mendel's works, point for point for point, he's paralleling The Origin of Species and discrediting The Origin of Species. Charles Darwin needed, remember that small variation Darwin talked about? He needed everything from really tall to really small and everything in between. Mendel said, no, genes say tall or short, not everything in between. And they didn't know what to do with him. 50 years later, they came up with this idea called neo-Darwinism. They invented mutations. Mutations, that answers this whole thing. You know, why does this fruit fly have red eyes and this one have white eyes? A mutation happened. All that Mendel stuff was just mutations. That worked until the 1950s. When mathematicians started analyzing evolutionary theory with math, they realized, you know what? Even with millions of years, we can't explain the difference between man and monkeys. That's not enough time. And they dealt with that for a while. They invented junk DNA in the 70s, and that lasted until we sequenced the human genome. That's dead. But this is what's happened recently. Back in the day, way back in the day, Darwinism reigned supreme. Darwinists could explain, or at least claim to explain, all the science that we knew. But it's gotten away from them. The modern technological revolution has unveiled so many things inside life that Darwinism cannot explain, that their power of explanation has collapsed as our understanding of life has accelerated. I said this earlier, I'll say it again. If life were really simple, Darwinism might explain it. See, in Darwin's day, life, was based on a cell, but a cell was just a bag of salts. They called it protoplasm. They didn't know what was inside the cell. And if it was square or round, whatever, grew a spike or turned purple, I could imagine all sorts of changes in a really simple system. The problem is, the more we understand about complexity, the power of Darwinism to explain it goes the opposite direction. And life as we know it today is not at all simple. Oh, there's a piece of DNA. That red thing zipping back and forth is inside you. It's called a polymerase. That polymerase is making copies of the DNA, the RNA. Each one of these is a different message. This might say, you're dead. Man. All right, you know what? I don't like Macs, but this is one thing Macs can do that Windows machines collapse, is video. Oh well. You saw all those overlapping red things, right? Each one of those was a different message. And what it's pointing out was that any single particular letter in the genome is used, on average, in 6 different messages. So that letter might affect your ability to digest garlic, how well you see in the dark, how tall you are, and what your skin color is. Not true, but it could affect 6 random things that have nothing to do with one another. Change that one letter. What happens now? Which trait is natural selection going to try to act on? It can't. The system grinds to a halt if one change affects multiple different things that have nothing to do with one another. And life is so complicated that we absolutely know that that is true. Let's see if this one works. I rebooted my computer earlier just to have it fresh. Oh, there we go. You started out as a little cell in your mama, and then you split, and then you split, and then you split. Well, the little machines are copying the DNA. There's 3 billion letters in your DNA. Every time they make a copy, they make mistakes. You have 100 trillion cells in your adult bodies. You're right now carrying every single possible mutation. Essentially, every day, your body develops every single cancer. Most of them are fixed, which is why you're still alive, but every once in a while, one escapes the fixing systems. It is estimated that a 50-year-old person has 60,000 mutations in every skin cell that they weren't born with. Yeah, I'm going to be 49 this year. I'm looking at 60,000 mutations, and I've got millions upon millions of skin cells. Every one of them has different mutations. You are going to die of mutation accumulation if you don't get hit by a bus. We can't stop it. There's nothing you can do to stop. Well, you can slow it down maybe, antioxidants or don't smoke and things like that. Those things help. But in general, it's going to catch up with everyone in this room, and we're going to die eventually because your body is actually falling apart. That's genetic entropy. But it's not just falling apart on the individual level. It's also falling apart on the species level. Because when we have children, we pass a small amount of mutations to our children. Every child born on average has about 100 mutations their parents weren't born with. Now, most mutations don't do anything. They don't affect reproduction. They don't affect intelligence. There's 1 out of 3 billion letters. Change one letter. What's the chance that that letter is going to kill you? Very small. But it's like rust on a car again. Our species, our genomes are rusting out over time. Natural selection is not improving us. It's just preventing us from going extinct quicker. That means actually it doesn't help Darwinism at all. You ever heard, creationism is not testable. You ever heard that? Evolution is testable. You're creation. You're just making stuff up. Well, that's not true. The Bible directly predicts 1 male and 1 female ancestor of all people. Guess what's true in genetics? There's only 1 male and 1 female ancestor of all people on earth. The evolutionists called her mitochondrial Eve and him Y chromosome Adam. They should have called him Y chromosome Noah, but okay, so they don't understand the Bible as well. They actually gave them biblical names anyway. The Bible predicts, because we only come from two people, you can't put a lot of genetic diversity into two people. I can explain all the people in this room. You give me 6,000 years of mutation, and God front-loading Adam and Eve with some genetic diversity that's not mutation, and we can put all the people here into Adam and Eve. We don't need millions of years. We don't need common ancestry with chimpanzees. The Bible also predicts one dispersal of humanity across the world. That's called the Tower of Babel in the Bible. The evolution is called out of Africa. Why do they start in Africa? Multiple reasons. I think there's some latent racism here because Darwin and his disciples always believed the Africans were closer to monkeys. And therefore, of course, we evolved in Africa. Today, there's a lot more diversity in Africa than other places in the world. And there's two ways to do that. Either you have an older population or your population went through more generations. There's lots of different ways to get differences between populations, and they're basing the entire thing on the fact that some Africans have more mutations than the rest of the world put together. But how do I know that's older? What if they're just like more mutated than everyone else alive today? If that's the case, then the origin of people isn't the place where everyone's spread out from. Think about it. The out of Africa theory says that small people groups traveling into uninhabited territory migrated with one Y chromosome and one mitochondrial ancestor in the recent past, even for an evolutionist, through the Middle East. All of those are things you would directly predict from the Tower of Babel account in Genesis. But they don't want you to think that way. I explain that, by the way, in this talk, Mitochondrial Eve and the Three Daughters of Noah. All right, I'm going to hit this subject very briefly. The origin of life. You see, if evolution can't explain the origin of life, then evolutionists need to go home. Darwin tried to avoid it. He joked. He said, you might as well talk about the origin of matter. Yeah, it's called Big Bang, Darwin. They talk about it now because people realize if we can't explain the origin of matter, what are we going to have? God explain it? You can't invoke God. That's not naturalism. You've seen this before, I'm sure. Come on now. There you go. Boom. You've seen this, right? The famous Miller-Urey experiment. They've got gases bubbling up, and they're zapping them with electricity, and they're dripping down here. Do you know what they're making down here? You know what that is? It's just random molecules. Because random chemical reactions produce random molecules. You are not made of random molecules. You're made of a very specific set of molecules. There's this many potential molecules that are made in that reaction, and you're made out of this many. That is not supposed to be true, but it is. Worse, there are molecules that you absolutely depend upon for life that can never be made in this reaction. They're too fragile. As soon as they touch one of these tar molecules, they're destroyed instantly. The origin of life, they cannot explain most complex organic molecules. Yeah, you can make some, fine, but not DNA, not proteins. They can't make polymers. This is funny. You are polymers. You have long chains of DNA, long chain proteins, and long chain sugars, long chain fats. That is you. This is what you're built of. Long molecules. All life, from the simplest bacterium to astronauts, require long molecules. The problem is the polymerization reaction that makes those molecules, a chemist would never do it in the presence of water. Because water always breaks the bonds apart, and it breaks it down so fast that chemists get rid of all the water because it'll destroy their proteins, their fats, anything they're trying to polymerize. So life had to start with no water? Worse, the last one there. How do you get instructions out of random molecules? See, DNA is not just a molecule. It's not just a code. It's a set of information. Essentially, you have an encyclopedia inside every one of your cells. That tells, you start with a single cell, and the instruction said in that cell said, make you. Without that instruction set, you can't have life. But that instruction set would never arise from random mistakes. Random mistakes produces genetic entropy. It destroys life. You couldn't start with a bunch of disorganized letters and randomly say, okay, let's just say you got a Scrabble set, right? And you pull out enough letters to spell out a chocolate chip cookie recipe. Is that ever going to happen? No. And if it did, someone accuse you of cheating. There is nothing in the origin of life, in chemistry, that suggests it's possible. In physics, that suggests it's possible. In probability, no way. Information theory? These are massive branches of science. All of them argue against the origin of life from natural processes, including this little guy. You know what that is? That's the world's smallest rotary engine. And just like our motors, it's powered by electricity. But instead of electrons, this guy is powered by protons, hydrogen nuclei, H+. Those protons make this thing spin. There's a rotor, there's a stator. Oh, and it takes this thing called ADP, that's phosphates. That doesn't exist in nature. Phosphate's too reactive. And it bonds it to this thing there called, this molecule is so reactive, you never find it in a free state in nature. This little thing here spins in circles and makes those purple things flying off. You make your own weight of this molecule called ATP every day. But you never find ATP in nature. Why did life decide to use ATP? And how did it find it before it started? Now I'm going to give you another really interesting thing that happens inside your cells right now. There's your piece of DNA again. DNA is a very long, fragile molecule. Now we're going to see something zip by here. This is a polymerase. Woo, there it goes. We're doing a little magic here. We're not showing all the complex things of getting things inside it. They're just floating in there magically. This polymerase is going by. It's unzipping the DNA. It's adding nucleotides to it. It's making a copy of the DNA. It's making a copy of a gene. Now, your genes are much more complicated than this. Your genes are spliced and diced before they're ready to be used. We're just really oversimplifying it just to show you what's happening. Now, when it gets to the end of the message, it says, stop. Message kicks out. But what's that thing good for? That RNA molecule has to be translated into protein. And we use these amazing little things. These are called transfer RNAs. At the bottom end of each transfer RNA, there's this 3-letter code that matches 3 letters in the DNA. And they go into this machine. It's called a ribosome. And inside the ribosome, which also has error-checking mechanisms in it, it takes these messenger RNAs, lines them up, literally pops an amino acid onto the growing protein strand that's happening inside every one of your cells millions of times every second, right now. But most proteins, if left to themselves, they'll fold into a blob and be not useful. And so these other molecules, they're called chaperones. They come and they grab onto the protein strand to prevent it from folding in properly. And they bring it to another molecule. We don't quite know how this thing works, but we know what it's shaped like and we know what it does. It's called the chaperonin, that little watermelon-shaped thing there. They stick this unfolded protein into the chaperonin. It then does this little magic and spits out a 3-dimensional folded protein. We started with the 1-dimensional letters A, T, G, and C and translated it into a 3-dimensional with 20 different letters of all the different amino acids in a protein. By the way, this depends upon ATP. That might be part of the ATP synthase engine. This is a chicken and egg problem now. Because all life uses ATP, all life needs ATP synthase. But you need ATP synthase to make ATP. You need ATP to translate the proteins that are part of the ATP synthase. Actually, it's a 3-way chicken and egg problem. If you don't have any of those, you're dead. How did life start? And why on earth would it be so complicated? And why? Literally, it's translating from Swahili to Sanskrit to Old Norse to computer programming language. Why would it do that? Unless it was not evolved by itself. All right, I'm running a little long. I'm going to try to hurry up here. My last section, science and morality. Before I go there, I want to show you one more big idea. Think of the smallest thing that you can see. Think of the shortest time that you can notice, a blink. There's a limit to what you can directly observe. Think of the largest thing you can see in the longest time you can experience, your lifetime. There is a zone of science that we can absolutely know, see, feel, touch, taste, whatever, right here. Now we can build things like microscopes and telescopes, and we can expand our zone of direct observation. But evolution is not here. Evolution is out here. Evolution is in the zone of deductions only. You can't directly test it. You can't directly see it. It is a historical science that knows nothing of the laboratory. Ouch. Bill Provine, he was a colleague of Dr. John Sanford's at Cornell, committed evolutionist. He said, "Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. There are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed forces of any kind. There is no life after death. When I die, I'm absolutely certain I'm going to be dead. That's the end for me. There's no ultimate foundation of ethics, no ultimate meaning of life, and no free will for humans either." Wow, this man understood the implications of Darwinism. Nihilism. There's no purpose to existence. You realize that if you believe in God, the evolutionist believes that you're carrying a mutation that you inherited from your monkey and fish ancestors that causes you to believe in God? You realize that the hardcore evolutionist thinks you're just a machine? Every thought and reaction of your mind is just chemicals. And the reason those chemicals exist and do those things is because they helped you have babies 100,000 years ago. What kind of life is that? No, if it's true, it's true. Fine, I got that. But how does science work with that thought? What if scientists are only a tribe of monkeys fighting over a pile of bananas? How do we trust them if that's true? Let me read you a quote from Charles Darwin's autobiography. He said, "Thus, disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress and have never since doubted, even for a second, that my conclusion was correct. I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, now include my father, my brother, and almost all of my friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is damnable doctrine." Now, wait a minute, Charles Darwin, you're not allowed to use that word. That's a theological word. You can't use that. Second of all, Charles Darwin just admitted that he was surrounded by atheists. In Victorian England, I thought that was like the height of Christianity, wasn't it? You know, the Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, Charles Spurgeon. Not amongst the intelligentsia of Europe. They were post-Christian in the 1700s. Charles Darwin was their chosen man to bring that post-Christian thought to the masses. They were already there. He continues, "A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or a future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest, or which seem to him the best ones. That is called hedonism." Yeah, welcome to 21st century America that is founded today upon evolutionary theory. Because if there is no God, if there is no judge, if there is no heaven and hell, have a party, man. Nothing matters. Now, Charles Darwin had some influential men in his life. One of them was Adam Sedgwick. He was a Christian. He's an old earth Christian. Okay, fine. But he was a Christian to his dying day. And he wrote this to Darwin as an old man to his younger disciple. He said, "I've read your book with more pain than pleasure." Ouch. "Parts I read with absolute sorrow because I think them utterly false and grievously mischievous. You've deserted the true method of induction." Could you imagine getting a letter like that? He continues. Now, at this part of his letter, he's talking about the link between the moral and the physical. Philosophers for centuries have been arguing, are we a machine or is there a ghost in the machine? Deus ex machina. Okay. I'm going to date myself here. You remember the Police album, Ghost in the Machine? We are spirits in the material world, our spirits in the... Yeah, no, all right. They're writing about this classical philosophical problem. And Sedgwick writes, "Were it possible, which thank God it is not, to break the link between the physical and the spiritual, humanity in my mind would suffer a damage that might brutalize it and sink the human race into a lower grade of degradation than any into which it has fallen, since its written records tell us of its history." He predicted the first half of the 20th century. Nazism, communism were all deeply rooted in evolutionary theory. And the reason why Stalin could sign an order that he knew would lead to the death of 30,000 people the next week, killing people is like cutting the grass. There's no spiritual side to people. They're just machines. And I wanted to make room for them. I wanted to make room, so I got rid of them. I mean, yikes. Romans 8:22 says, "We know the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now." Charles Darwin looked at the fossil record, and he said, how could a good and loving God have created that? And therefore he rejected God. What does the Bible say? The Bible says that suffering and death came into the world after creation. It's not God's fault. The Bible claims it's man's fault. God didn't create suffering and death. It's part of the curse that's applied to the world after creation. It's part of that curse that we all yearn to escape. And the Bible promises that we will escape it. In the end of Revelation 21, the beginning of Revelation 21, the Bible says, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shouldn't be no more pain, for the former things are passed away. Evolution claims that the sorrow, the death, the crying, the pain produces people over millions of years. And therefore, so what about sorrow, death, pain, and suffering? Whatever. We need another war. Let's get rid of all the Muslims. Kill them all. They're threatening me and my progeny. What if a Muslim comes over and blows up my kids? Better to kill the Muslim first. No, I didn't really mean that. I was being sarcastic. You understand that, right? But in an evolutionary world, how is that wrong? Where is morality in Darwinism? It does not exist. Now, it's not immoral. It's amoral. In that system, there's no God that you can appeal to for any sort of a moral judgment. It's just hedonism. And Charles Darwin said it quite clearly in his book. Now, I struggled here because there's a lot of things I wanted to say, and I did go a little bit long, but I'm only 59 seconds. No, I'm not. I'm almost 10 minutes past. All right.